I think it's all.
I hope so.
I don't
We
see
needed
it.
to. How about that?
Yeah, I know.
You might.
Page from Vince Lombardi, who always started his meetings a few minutes early, so since we're all here, if there's no objection, we will begin. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, is authorized to participate in today's hearing. This subcommittee is convening to examine the management of spent nuclear fuel, concerns related to the storage of nuclear waste, and the need for long-term solutions. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. I'm proud that we've been able to bring a little bit of DC here to OC as we convene this hearing in Laguna Niguel to examine the management and storage of our nation's nuclear waste and the need for Congress to take action to find long-term solutions. Questions related to the long-term safety of America's storage of nuclear waste are not new. The first commercial nuclear power plant in the United States was opened by President Dwight Eisenhower in 1958, Act of 1982, which dictated that the federal government would identify a permanent geological repository and begin transferring waste from nuclear power plants by 1998. As we sit here today, it has been over 2 decades since the 1998 deadline, and over 50 years since the opening of this nation's first nuclear power plant. And the federal government has failed and continues to fail to find a solution to our country's nuclear waste problem. Without a permanent repository, There are now approximately 100 sites across at least 34 states currently storing high-level nuclear waste. Americans' exposure to these risks associated with having nuclear waste in our communities does not fall along any partisan or Democratic lines. Approximately 1 in every 3 Americans now live within 50 miles of nuclear waste. Nuclear reactors and spent nuclear fuel sites sit in congressional districts represented by both Democrats and Republicans, and the serious challenges at hand affect communities across our country. One of these sites, the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, SONGS, is less than 20 miles from where we sit right now. So let's put that into context. After the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, recommended that Americans in Japan evacuate 50 miles away from that site. Currently, an estimated 8.4 million Americans live within the 50-mile radius of the SONGS plant that is 20 miles from here. That includes residents of Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties. As a resident of Laguna Beach, my family and I live just 30 miles from the SONGS site. I hear the concerns of my constituents and those of Southern California. I too am concerned about the long-term risk associated with storing 3.6 million pounds of nuclear waste at SONGS. This nuclear waste is just about 100 feet from the shoreline, sits adjacent to one of the nation's busiest highways, and near to seismic fault lines. Since the promise fueled by the first wave of nuclear reactors in the 1950s, we have seen highly publicized meltdowns at 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and waste management challenges around the globe. It is clear that nuclear power waste and waste are not without significant risk. Commercial nuclear power production in the United States has created over 160 million pounds of spent nuclear fuel, and an additional 28 million pounds of nuclear waste has been created by nuclear weapons production and other defense-related activities. And it is estimated that we will be adding another 120 million pounds in the next several decades. So that will be a total of 280 million pounds of nuclear waste with no home and risking the homes and lives of over 100 million Americans. As chairman of this subcommittee, the protection of public health and safety are among my top priorities. I'm committed to focusing the federal government's attention on its obligation to protect the public from nuclear hazards and advocate for the environment, and to work and hold appropriate agencies accountable. If we take steps now to fully recognize the magnitude of our country's nuclear waste problem, and if we reach across the aisle to develop bipartisan legislation, the United States can pursue workable solutions. But we do not have any more time to waste. The clock is ticking. In fact, because of the challenges and logistics involved with moving and housing nuclear waste with a long-term viable solution, the best case scenarios, if we act now with purpose and expediency, is approximately 10 years out. My hope is that we can all agree that our current and past failed efforts to both develop and implement a plan has not led to a viable or safe long-term solution. Our government owes the American people an effective plan to address our nuclear waste storage problem, a plan that securely stores this waste without presenting health and safety concerns for local communities across the country. The radioactive material at the core of this challenge will outlast everyone in this room and all humans currently alive. It is estimated that all of our nation's nuclear waste will remain radioactive for somewhere between 100,000 and 1 million years. I hope that my statements adequately portray the seriousness of this dilemma. My thoughts and feelings are informed by the fact that our action or inaction will have a direct impact on the lives of our children, grandchildren, and hundreds of future generations. I thank all of you for joining us today, and I appreciate all of our witnesses for both their ongoing work on this important issue and for taking the time to join us today. I know that many of you have traveled considerable distances to be here and have prepared thoughtful testimony to present. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Comer of Kentucky, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this field hearing. I also want to thank the local community for hosting us today. This hearing is a continuation of the fact-finding we've done in Washington and will do elsewhere around the country to find energy policy solutions. When we think about the federal government's involvement in energy policy, it has an important role to play in ensuring the safety of our nuclear power plants, and the safe storage of nuclear waste. There are approximately 90,000 metric tons of nuclear waste in the United States that require safe disposal. And the level of nuclear waste in the United States is expected to increase to 140,000 metric tons over the next few decades. Yet there is still no permanent disposal site that has been fully approved by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Department of Energy. Anyone serious about tackling these challenges knows that to address the United States' capacity to responsibly manage and store nuclear waste, we must commit to fund the completion of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's review of the Yucca Mountain licensing application. While it may be politically expedient to say otherwise, the reality is that Congress must take action to ensure that proper funding is distributed to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy so that the Yucca Mountain licensing application may be fully reviewed and completed. Let me be clear. Nuclear energy has an important role to play in our nation's energy needs. It emits zero carbon emissions and is incredibly efficient. But we must solve the problem of where to put nuclear waste. The nuclear waste at San Onofre has sat here for too long, and this community deserves resolution. I want to thank the witnesses appearing here today, including the former chairman of this committee, Darrell Issa, who represented this area for 18 years. Despite no longer being a member of Congress, Mr. Issa clearly cares deeply about this issue, this community, and finding a resolution to the problem. I want to note that his testimony supports bipartisan solutions to this problem, and I'm optimistic that one of those solutions can make its way to the President's desk this Congress. I look forward to discussion today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Comer. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Congressman Levin, and before I turn the microphone over to him, I want to applaud Congressman Levin for his unbelievable commitment to addressing this issue. As you know, Songs lies in the district he represents, and with his leadership, I'm confident we can hopefully get to a bipartisan solution. So, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Don't they let you speak first before you applaud? Thank you, Chairman Ruda. Thank you to our ranking members as well. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's field hearing. The spent nuclear fuel at San Onofre in my district has been a central focus and will remain a central focus of my service. I regularly hear the same question all across our district, from Dana Point to Oceanside and San Clemente to Del Mar. When are you going to get the nuclear waste off our beach? And together we've made it a bipartisan priority in Washington to fight for solutions to the challenges at Songs and its spent nuclear fuel sites all across the country. Unfortunately, these aren't challenges that are going to be solved in a few months or even a few years, but I strongly believe it's long past time they've received the attention they deserve, especially given the risk that nuclear waste poses to the communities in our district and elsewhere in Southern California. I look at the issues associated with the spent fuel at Songs on 2 tracks. First, it's our job as members of Congress to ensure that the federal government is providing robust oversight for the decommissioning activities at Songs. And second, we must work with our colleagues in Washington to find solutions that result in the removal of spent nuclear fuel from San Onofre. This is particularly important given the environmental factors that make Songs a higher risk site than most nuclear sites across the country. I'm pleased that today's hearing focuses on solutions and continues to shine a spotlight on all the work we have ahead of us. I'm pleased to report that we've accomplished a lot in the last 5 months. First, I've convened a Songs task force co-chaired by Rear Admiral Len Herring, a former Navy mayor of San Diego, and Greg Yasto, a former chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Admiral Herring, Mr. Yasto, and their partners on the task force are analyzing issues regarding the on-site management of spent nuclear fuel at Songs and working to help identify a path forward that fully protects the community and environment around the plant. At the same time, I've been fighting to make Southern California Edison and its contractor at Songs, Holtec, more transparent with our communities. They must make all decisions with the focus on safety rather than maximizing profits. I've been concerned about some recent events. At the end of March, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission assessed Edison with 2 high-level violations and a $116,000 fine for an incident last year during which a spent fuel canister nearly dropped 18 feet and then was not properly reported. And in April, the NRC issued 2 more violations to Holtec because of design changes to canisters at Songs. The changes resulted in loose pins at the bottom of the canisters that hold tons of nuclear waste. Given the multiple incidents and violations, that have taken place at Songs, I believe the NRC must exercise its full authority to enforce safe practices at the site, which unfortunately has a history of inadequate transparency. That's why I have called on the NRC to assign a full-time inspector to Songs. Senators Feinstein and Harris, as well as Representatives Ruda, Peters, Vargas, and Davis, joined me in making that demand. Nearly 2 months after we sent a formal letter to the NRC on the subject, we've yet to receive a response. I hope that's an issue we can explore further during the questioning portion of the hearing. On top of these Songs oversight activities, I've been working with my colleagues in Congress to create a pathway to get the spent fuel off the beach at San Onofre. Next week, my legislation that makes Songs one of the highest priority sites in the nation for spent fuel removal is receiving a hearing before the House Energy and Commerce Committee. The bill, called the Spent Fuel Prioritization Act, ensures fuel from decommissioned nuclear sites in areas with larger populations and higher seismic risk, such as ours, is removed first. This concept has broad bipartisan support. However, in order to prioritize removing the spent nuclear fuel off the beach at San Onofre, we must have somewhere to move it to. Due to a request I led with my colleagues, the spending bill the House is set to consider next week includes $25 million for a consent-based interim storage program at the Department of Energy. Similar requests have been made for the past 5 years, and I'm proud that this is the first year that it was adopted into the House spending bill. Interim storage is not a comprehensive solution to the spent fuel challenge, and it certainly must proceed with a consent-based process. But it is currently the most viable pathway to move spent nuclear fuel away from the rising Pacific Ocean, off of active fault lines, and further from population centers in Orange and San Diego counties. It's also a solution that both the House and Senate have expressed bipartisan support for, so it has a real chance to move forward. Spent fuel storage and disposal are complex and challenging issues. In fact, my own thinking has evolved as I've met with our military and civilian leadership and received a number of briefings on the safest option for our communities. With that in mind, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses and receiving additional input from a variety of technical experts. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge my predecessor, who's here to testify. I appreciate his past efforts and his continued interest in this issue, and believe it's an area where we can work together on a bipartisan basis for the benefit of those in our district and for all of Southern California. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Levin. For those in the audience, thank you for coming, and thank you for your passion and commitment to helping us address a very important issue. But I would also respectfully ask that you not wave signs while you are here. This would be more consistent with the protocol of these committee meetings, both in DC and in the field. Now I would want to welcome our witnesses. Scott Morris, Region 4 Administrator with the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Region 4. Tom Isaacs, former Lead Advisor, Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future. Daniel T. Stetson, Vice Chairman, Songs Community Engagement Panel. Don Hancock, Nuclear Waste Program Director, Southwest Research and Information Center. Daryl Issa, former member of Congress. Please stand and raise your right hands, and I will begin swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Let the record show that the witness is affirmed in the affirmative. Answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. I will note that the microphones tend to be a little bit sensitive, so please make sure they are close to you and you speak directly into them. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. With that, Mr. Issa, you are now recognized to give a 5-minute oral presentation of your testimony.
Okay, I guess it's always hot. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and my successor, Mr. Levin. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that a letter addressed to the chairman in support of this hearing and the project that are being considered in Congress from the Orange County Board of Supervisors. So 5 minutes in the light, as well as any of us who have served. As Congressman Levin said, this is not a partisan issue. It is a regional issue that is going to take members like the gentleman from Kentucky and the two gentlemen from California working together to push for a solution. The fact that the yucca is based on both Republicans and Democrats in a state that chose not to want the product. That would be true of some people in every state in which you will propose shipping it. When I came to Congress 19 years ago, what I became aware of is we didn't have a low-level repository because people decided that they couldn't find a place in California, so we were shipping the like to, and I apologize, I think it was Kentucky, but it could have been Tennessee, to the repository back there which had been produced, essentially paying to offload our responsibility across the country in freight cars at some incremental risk and certainly, well, shirking our responsibility. In the case of the National Repository, it's not California's responsibility, as other witnesses will say. We did have sites considered, but California, in spite of its great size in some remote areas, does sit on an earthquake fault, does have some other challenges, and it was not, by anyone's definition, the best place. I think the one thing that everyone should come away from this hearing with is a recognition that no matter what Southern California Edison does, they will never have as safe a storage place as long as it lies between the ocean and I-5 as a myriad of other locations in New Mexico, in Texas, Nevada, and to be honest, in an awful lot of other places we could find. Some decade ago, I went to Area 51, as it sometimes gets called, or the Nevada test site. And I witnessed firsthand, as we flew over, those mounds, and people can see it on Google Earth, it's not a big secret, the mounds that were produced by underground nuclear testing. The fact is, we have vast areas that you and I will not be able to go to and walk around for the rest of our lives and lives well beyond our great-great-great-great-grandchildren. So when we look at where we are today and where we were 18 years ago plus, when I came to Congressman Ron Packard came and he knew in 1982 that they needed to deal with nuclear power residue, and he voted as a freshman to empower a solution. In those 36 years, what we've always known is there are nuclear rods and like material, and I would say today, for the record, that if we cannot agree on yucca, then by definition we will have another site, an interim site. And when I say interim is 10,000 years. If we of what might happen. If we do not do that, then we will have 100 sites. And although we may be, by many people's estimation, one of the worst, if it is in your backyard, anywhere in the country, including my home state and the chairman's home state of Ohio, if you're up there on Lake Erie and the largest body of fresh water, and you've got spent rods that, if there were a disaster, would take about 1/5 of the world's fresh water and contaminate it, then you have a similar view to what all of us do here in Southern California. And I think it's particularly positive that we have a chairman who knows both the Great Lakes dilemma with its nuclear plants and Californians. So I want to thank you for inviting me here. I want to make sure that we understand here today that what we have to do is get Congress to move. It is not a question of Republican or Democrat. It is the question of a will to move after, and I took it down, 21 years after.
Thank you, Mr. Isa. At this time, I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Hancock for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to present my organization's views on this important, complex, and difficult subject. We very much appreciate your leadership in looking for solutions that Congress can take. My name is Don Hancock. I'm with Southwest Research and Information Center, which is a private nonprofit organization incorporated in New Mexico. For the last 48 years, we've worked on a wide variety of environmental justice, health issues, including nuclear waste. So there's been some discussion already of the history. I want to spend briefly looking at 5 levels. Essential, scientifically sound, publicly accepted program for safe disposal of large amounts of very radioactive, very long-lived nuclear waste. Since 1971, even before, there the first proposed repository was in 1971. So for all of these years, we've had technically problematic sites being proposed, which engender a lot of public opposition and don't get operated and are built, so we don't have repositories. Secondly, there's not consensus about health and safety standards, including whether commercial spent fuel is safe where it is. If it is safe where it is, why move it? If it's not safe where it is, how can it be safe to transport through many other communities to someplace else? Thirdly, in our federal system, storage and disposal facilities require consent, as we've just described for decades. Further, many states have specifically not consented to hosting such facilities. Nevada has made very clear that its technical and legal opposition to Yucca Mountain. Congress should formally repeal the selection of Yucca Mountain as a repository site. Fourth, without a repository program, spent fuel will continue to stay at or near reactor sites for decades, including at closed reactors, unless the nuclear industry is willing to volunteer its own reactor storage sites. Thus, improved storage measures are needed to better protect public health and the environment, which is what my organization and hundreds of other nonprofit organizations have been advocating for years. And I've attached to my testimony principles for safeguarding nuclear waste at reactors, which represent those principles. So for San Onofre, which appropriately all the people in this room are particularly concerned about, the fuel needs to be moved away from the ocean to higher ground for storage in robust atmospherically controlled building. Fifth, New Mexico has some history in all of this too. First important point to recognize is New Mexico is been and has always been a majority population of people of color. The state has disproportionately borne the negative impacts of the nuclear fuel chain, including contamination and resulting health effects from the first nuclear bomb, which was not in Hiroshima, it was at the Trinity site in New Mexico. We have continuing victims from that all these years later, again, mostly people of color who have not been recognized, compensated, or cared for. Uranium mining and processing started 70 years ago. A huge amount of the uranium to fuel the Cold War came from New Mexico and the Navajo Nation. We have more than 1,000 abandoned sites that have not been cleaned up that continue to be health problems, again, primarily for indigenous people in our state. Thirdly, Los Alamos National Lab, which was created during World War II to build the first bomb and test the bomb, is there, and it continues to be a long-term source of contamination. Fourth, New Mexico also has the nation's only operating geologic repository, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is for defense, transuranic, or plutonium-contaminated waste. New Mexico, however, has never had commercial spent fuel. No reactors, no commercial fuel. That doesn't mean it hasn't been discussed. When it's been proposed, we've said no. We've been promised no. The Land Withdrawal Act federal law says no, but yet there are still proposals, one in the 90s from the Mescalero Apaches, or two, and a current one from Holtec International, which we're also saying no to. But there are ways forward. But continuing targeting New Mexico is not scientifically sound, is not publicly accepted, and is an environmental injustice. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Stetson, now you have 5 minutes to do for your opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear and testify at today's meeting. My name is Dan Stetson, and I serve as Vice Chairman of the Community Engagement Panel, or CEP, for the San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, or SONGS for short. I was invited here today to serve as a representative of the SONGS CEP. The CEP was formed in early 2014 after the retirement of Songs in 2013. The purpose of the CEP is to serve as a bridge and conduit between SCE and the local community. The 18 members of the CEP represent a range of stakeholders, from environmental NGOs and Native American tribes to business and organized labor. More than half are local elected officials, from Oceanside to Dana Point, sworn to represent the best interests of their constituents. All of us are volunteers. The 3 officers, including Chairman David Victor of UC San Diego, myself, Vice Chairman, and Jerry Kern, immediate past City Council member from Oceanside, provide input to SCE on agenda topics and public engagement. We hold quarterly meetings and periodic workshops. All are open to the public for transparency. Meetings are webcast live and video recordings are posted online. We provide at least 1 full hour at every meeting for public input. Over the past 5 years, the CEP has addressed a wide range of issues that are important to the local communities, but I've learned that they really boil down to 2. The first one is safely managing the spent fuel that's on site, and number 2, safely removing the spent fuel from the site. Let me first address on-site storage, and more specifically, dry cask storage. This is what we on the CEP have come to call defense in depth for dry cask storage. Defense in depth means looking at the full complement of means to support safe on-site storage of spent fuel. This starts with the design and fabrication of spent fuel canisters, while also considering operations, maintenance, and security, as well as canister inspections and remediation of a compromised canister. Over the past 5 years, are included in every single one of those meetings. As a result of these meetings, SCE has taken several addressed steps is the laser peening the welds of the new canisters to minimize the risk of chloride-induced stress corrosion, cracking of the canister shells. They have also agreed to provide radiation monitoring as long as the fuel is on site. The second important issue is safely moving the spent fuel off-site. Over the years, most, but not all members of the local community have expressed an interest in moving the spent fuel off-site from San Onofre to a federally licensed storage or disposal facility. Off-site has also been addressed at every single CEP meeting. The ongoing costs are also a very important consideration. As the schedule for the Department of Energy to remove spent fuel continues to slip, the 2018 audit report of the Office of the Inspector General estimates that the slippage cost to the American taxpayer of over $35 billion. This translates to over $2.2 million per day that we don't move the fuel. To address offsite storage in 2017, Chairman David Victor delivered testimony before the House Oversight and Government Reform Subcommittee on Interior, Energy, and Environment. David, Jerry, and I, and other CEP members, have met and continue to meet with members of the California Congressional Delegation to advance federal legislation for spent fuel. Congressional outreach is a part of a broader effort to try to effect changes to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and enable consolidated interim storage and permanent disposal. I sincerely appreciate the request by Representatives Ruda, Levin, and others for $25 million in the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill to help fund CIS transportation and infrastructure. On behalf of the Songs Community Engagement Panel, let me close by thanking you for making this a top priority of your administrations. We look forward to congressional action to safely remove the spent fuel from San Onofre. With the passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, Congress made a solemn promise to the American people. To date, that promise remains unfulfilled. We are counting on you to keep this promise and solve this seemingly intractable problem once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stetson. Now I recognize you, Mr. Isaacs, for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm pleased that you and other members of Congress are focusing on this important issue. In 2010, the administration halted the extensive yet controversial work on Yucca Mountain, calling the program unworkable. The Secretary of Energy was directed by the President to establish a Blue Ribbon Commission, or BRC. The BRC was co-chaired by General Brent Scowcroft, a Republican and National Security Advisor to 2 U.S. presidents, and Congressman Lee Hamilton, a Democrat, and 17-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives and Vice Chair of the 9/11 Commission. After 2 years of work by the 16 distinguished commissioners on the BRC, we produced a report entitled Blue Ribbon Commission Report on America's Nuclear Future. The report put forward 8 fundamental recommendations. I will not describe all of them here as the report is readily available online, but 4 stand out. The first recommendation was that the program should move forward with consent-based siting. That is, new facilities dedicated to the storage and disposal of spent nuclear fuel should be sited in locations where there was adequate consent by those who would be affected. The second recommendation was that the program be moved from the Department of Energy and established as a standalone organization focused solely on this challenge. This was not so much a criticism of DOE as a recognition that to establish the requisite program stability, trust, and confidence required a dedicated program over decades and a degree of buffering from short-term political considerations. The third and fourth recommendations called for prompt actions dedicated to siting and building both interim storage and final disposal facilities for spent nuclear fuel. I believe that the nation owes all of us a pragmatic and timely solution to nuclear waste management. There are a number of compelling reasons that spent nuclear fuel should be moved from reactor sites everywhere, but particularly where reactors have been shut down. These arguments include economics, national security, and environmental considerations, and the BRC report describes them in detail. Disposal in a deep, stable underground repository is the preferred solution for every country that is addressing this issue, and this has been the case for decades. There is an international consensus and confidence that such repositories can be licensed, constructed, operated, and then closed, permanently isolating the waste from the accessible environment. The U.S. government has been liable for the delays which are costing taxpayers billions of dollars, and the liabilities continue to grow. Shut down sites should have their spent fuel removed to allow for full decommissioning of the sites and their return to productive use. The central reason I believe that waste must be removed is simple. It's the right thing to do. When communities, regions, and states accepted the siting of nuclear power plants in their vicinity, they did not sign up to be the host of these waste facilities located on the surface forever. We should not leave a legacy to our children and our children's children to clean up after us because we did not have the political will to meet our responsibilities. So what are we going to do? The first problem, in my view, is the mistaken view that there's little or no crisis here, and since any solution is politically charged, the easiest path at any point in time is to do nothing. As I've stated, we owe it to ourselves, future generations, and the rest of the world who look to us for leadership to solve this highly solvable problem. Second, we need to understand and respect that there are differing views by responsible people who truly want to solve this issue. We are unlikely to get there as long as this is viewed as a win-lose situation. Third, we need to establish a national waste program that has the requisite talent, stability, flexibility, and access to the required funding to do the job and work every day to earn the trust and confidence of affected parties. Fourth, we need a vibrant program to demonstrate our commitment to success and to reassert our international leadership and lead by example to assure that safety, nuclear security, nonproliferation, and counterterrorism remain effective across the globe. Let me conclude by quoting from the Blue Ribbon Commission report. The problem of nuclear waste may be unique in the sense that there is wide agreement about the outlines of the solution. Simply put, we know what we have to do. We know we have to do it, and we even know how to do it. Experience in the United States and abroad has shown that suitable sites for deep geologic repositories can be identified and developed. The knowledge and experience we need are in hand, and the necessary funds have been collected. Rather, the core difficulty remains what it has always been, finding a way to site these inherently controversial facilities and to conduct the waste management program in a manner that allows all stakeholders, but most especially host states, tribes, and communities, to conclude that their interests have been adequately protected and their well-being enhanced. That sees the sole responsibility are among the key next steps for our shared success.
Thank you, Mr. Isaacs. Mr. Morris, Chair now recognizes you for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Chairman Ruda, Ranking Member Comer, Congressman Levin. My name is Scott Morris, and I'm the administrator for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Region 4 office based in Arlington, Texas. I am a 26-year veteran of the agency and a retired U.S. Navy nuclear submarine officer. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today to discuss the NRC's role and response associated with the oversight of high-level radioactive waste. I will also provide the status on licensing of permanent proposed interim spent fuel storage facilities. Finally, I will describe the NRC's oversight of the handling and storage of high-level radioactive waste at the nation's current and former commercial power reactor sites. The NRC was designated by statute as the independent regulator for overseeing the design, construction, operation, and eventual closure of a geologic repository for the permanent disposal of high-level radioactive waste at Yucca Mountain, Nevada. In 2008, the NRC received a license application from the U.S. Department of Energy, which is responsible for siting, constructing, and operating the repository. The NRC completed its safety evaluation report for the application in January of 2015 and a final and supplement to DOE's final environmental impact statement in 2016. With two exceptions related to land and water use, the NRC staff concluded in its safety evaluation report that DOE's application met all applicable requirements for issuance of the construction authorization. However, the final decision on whether to authorize construction cannot be made until an adjudicatory hearing is completed and the Commission completes its review of contested and uncontested issues. The adjudicatory hearing associated with the application was suspended in 2011. Over the past 3 years, the NRC has received 2 applications for consolidated interim storage facilities. One from the Interim Storage Partners for a facility in Texas, and a second from Voltec International for a facility in New Mexico. The NRC staff had anticipated completing its review and issuing final licensing decisions for both applications in the summer of 2020. However, that schedule for both applications is expected to change based on the completeness and the timeliness of answers to staff questions on the applications and whether or not evidentiary hearings will be held. So, until a permanent repository or a consolidated interim storage facility is licensed and operational, NRC licensees may store spent fuel in spent fuel pools or in dry storage casks. The NRC has determined that both methods of storage are adequate to protect public health and safety and the environment. Dry storage casks can be arranged in vertical, horizontal, or underground systems at the plant site, known as independent spent fuel storage installations, or simply ISFICs. The NRC reviews all spent fuel storage cask system designs before they are certified for use to ensure that they can protect against natural phenomena such as seismic events, tornadoes, flooding, and can also withstand potential impacts from airborne debris or accidental drops of storage and handling equipment. NRC regulations do not specify a maximum time for storing spent fuel. The Commission has determined that spent fuel can be stored safely in a pool or dry storage cask for at least 120 years. Dry storage casks are licensed or certified for up to 40 years, with possible renewals of up to 40 years. In conclusion, NRC licensees are safely handling and storing spent fuel, and the agency will continue to provide oversight to ensure adequate protection of the public health and safety and the environment. Chairman Ruda, Ranking Member Comer, Congressman Levin, this concludes my prepared remarks. Thank you for the opportunity today, and I'll be pleased to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Thanks to all of you for your opening comments. I'm going to reserve my opening 5 minutes of questions and yield to the distinguished member from Kentucky, Ranking Member Mr. Comer, for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank the witnesses for their testimony. Before I ask a couple of questions, I just want to make certain here that the entire panel agrees that the current business model to store nuclear waste is unsustainable, correct? Everyone agrees with that. That wasn't really touched upon in the testimony was the potential threat of terrorist attacks and the homeland security risk. Do you believe that most commercial nuclear power plants where nuclear fuel is stored is safe from potential terrorist attacks?
I believe that this has been looked at quite closely by the NRC, and they have found that when you look at credible potential incidents, that these facilities have been adequately designed and implemented to be protected. But I would ask my colleague to perhaps talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a robust regulatory regime in place to ensure adequate protection of the spent fuel in either type of installation. And in addition to assuring their compliance through the licensing process, we also provide robust and routine oversight to ensure that those measures continue to remain in place and are reliable.
What about the transportation process and the risk of consensus on, for example, Yucca Mountain? What's the potential threat there? And I'm sure that's something that's been studied thoroughly as well.
It has, and with respect to federal entities that are actively involved, of course, the NRC, because we are the ones that approve the designs for the record, that the type of the design and the testing that those transport casks has to endure are pretty robust and involve extreme temperatures, impacts, full submersion, etc. And so we regulate, the NRC regulates the Department of Transportation is responsible for the driver, whatever vehicle is used to transport the cask. And we work with the Department of Transportation to identify and approve prior to shipment secure transport paths.
Before I yield back, I just want to say that I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, to try to come up with a solution, a sustainable solution. In my district in Kentucky, we have a uranium enrichment site that's being deactivated. It's right on the Ohio River. I mean, literally right on the Ohio River. And I think that's an issue that everyone's mentioned is bipartisan. It's an issue that affects probably a majority of members of Congress. And it's something that I appreciate the purpose of this hearing and look forward to finding a solution. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Morris, thank you for generally being available, for taking the time to brief me on a number of occasions. I look forward to our continued opportunities to work together. I wanted to begin, I want to get through quite a few questions with you. I wanted to start with some basic yes or no questions. Is it true that the NRC found that the near-miss incident at Songs was caused by deficiencies in Southern California Edison's training, equipment, procedures, and oversight?
Yes.
Did the NRC find that Southern California Edison's staff at Songs were not properly trained, certified, and supervised?
Yes.
Is it true that Southern California Edison failed to formally report the near-miss incident within the time frame required by the NRC?
Yes.
And is it true that a similar event had previously taken place at Songs, but Southern California Edison didn't take corrective action to ensure it wouldn't happen again?
Yes.
With these findings in mind, and this is not a yes or no question, can you please explain to us why the NRC fined Southern California $16,000 earlier this year?
Absolutely, and I'll try to be brief. We did once we became aware of the incident, we constituted a special inspection team, a team of experts that we sent from our Arlington office who spent a week on site. They worked closely to understand the circumstances around the incident, and in subsequent weeks and months continue to work with Edison to fully understand the root causes of their event. I think it's fair to say we provided a lot of input into that process to ensure that their causal analysis was those issues, and we ultimately satisfied ourselves that the corrective actions that they initiated were appropriate and robust. Of course, we'll continue to inspect and ensure going forward that they're in accordance with its license to factors alone were the basis for our enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Along with the fine, Edison was assessed level 2 and 3 violations, which the NRC refers to as escalated violations and significant enforcement actions. Is it common for NRC licensees to receive level 2 violations?
It's quite uncommon, and the incident at Edison is unprecedented in terms of the level level of significance.
So as I mentioned in my opening statement, my colleagues and I wrote to the NRC and Region 4 urging you to assign a full-time inspector to songs. We haven't received a response from the chair, but Region 4 has told our staff that instead of a full-time inspector, you will quote, you will have, quote, unannounced inspections on a frequent basis. Do you have the authority to assign a full-time inspector to songs?
It's actually a matter of policy. We implement the policy and
But you have the legal authority.
Oh, yes. The commission certainly does.
So I again strongly urge you to do so. Your testimony today has illustrated the unique situation at Songs and the urgency and the site's disappointing track record with regard to transparency and reporting, I think warrants this unusual measure. With the time that I have, and I have more questions for a second round, so Mr. Chairman, hopefully we'll get to that. Mr. Isaacs, I wanted to thank you for bringing your expertise and experience to today's hearing. Do you think that a commercial reactor site located near an active fault is less safe than one located in an area without any earthquake hazard?
Sure.
And do you think larger populations near commercial reactor sites increase the risk associated with the site?
In general, yes.
So the Blue Ribbon Commission report that you referred to discussed a new approach to prioritizing the transfer of spent fuel from reactor sites and said prioritization policy, and I quote, should be done first by safety and risk considerations. The Blue Ribbon Commission also from decommissioned nuclear reactor sites in areas with larger populations and higher seismic risk. Do you agree?
Careful and thorough system study to look at all of the potential benefits and risks of various schemes for picking up spent fuel when it is possible to do so, and prioritize the spent fuel, the actual operation based on optimizing in terms of cost, environmental concerns, safety concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Isaacs. I'm out of time for now. I hope we have another round. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Levin, and you raised an interesting point. Well, this is going to be a little less formal than a typical committee meeting in the sense that I'm going to enter into some questions shortly, and at the conclusion of my 5 minutes, I'm going to allow the three of us to really ask questions of all of you and hopefully have a more open narrative than the structure of a typical committee meeting. And I'm also hopeful at the end that we might have if there's any important final comments any of you would like to get out before we break up, welcome comments. And we will also have some questions that I have received from people around the country who want to ask questions. So there'll be a few questions there as well. One housekeeping, I would like to recognize that Supervisor Bartlett and Mayor Jennings from Laguna Niguel, and current council member and former Mayor Tony Eisman from Laguna Beach are here. We appreciate having your support and presence here as well. So I'm going to yield to myself 5 minutes for questions. And Mr. Isaacs, I'm going to start with you because we sat next to each other at a meeting at Songs, I guess maybe 6 weeks ago or so. And if I recall correctly, you shared with me at that meeting that part of the issue as to why we have not had a long-term solution, one in 1958 and many more in the 60s, we never thought we were going to have any nuclear waste that needed to be stored. Do I recall that correctly?
Almost. What I sort of said, and I think is true, is when I started my career in those days, the stock answer to the question of why don't we build a repository was largely, if we built one, it would stand empty. And the reason for that was at that point in time that there would be a massive growth of nuclear power plants. In fact, the standard planning objectives at those times were 1,000 reactors by the year 2000. We fell short, of course, by 900 reactors of that. The expectation at that point in time was if we have that many reactors, at some point we're going to start running out of uranium. It's going to get scarce and it's going to be very expensive. And so what we should do is prepare to reprocess that spent fuel to extract out the unused uranium and probably the plutonium that is produced and recycle it back into reactors. And the truth is, uranium for centuries. The uranium that's already mined is there. So it was very appealing in that sense. So if you were going to reprocess the spent fuel, which we wound up not doing because the nuclear industry did not continue to grow the way we anticipated, then we found ourselves in a situation which I think was unfortunate we should have built one, where we have an expectation that we were going to be reprocessing, we would then take the spent fuel, extract the waste, and then we would put the waste only in. So that would be the time to build it.
So in essence, the continued supply of uranium has not created the market demand for the reprocessing of spent nuclear fuel?
I would say in most cases that's true. There are a couple of countries that have invested in reprocessing, France being the most notable case. They have reprocessed fuel. They have put the unused parts of that back into reactors. That doesn't avoid the need for a repository, whether you reprocess. I want to make clear, as I think I told you, to avoid the need for an ultimate permanent disposal.
And Mr. Morse, that confirms the conversation we had earlier too, that even if we did reprocess, recycle, we would never get to a zero amount of spent nuclear fuels that would have to be deposited somewhere.
That's correct.
Okay. Mr. Hancock, we talked a little bit earlier too about the standards for the long-term entombment of spent nuclear waste. And there's a debate about what those standards should be. But my guess is that the standards are within a window as to what the experts believe they should be. And I guess my question is, couldn't we as a country right now be identifying multiple sites in the United States that are within the parameters of the potential standards being set forth by various experts and begin a market-based process to determine multiple sites rather than putting all of our efforts into one egg in the basket, which was Yucca Mountain?
Well, as I've said, I think Yucca Mountain should be stopped, and I think that's frankly a crucial first step, because to have this program that you're talking about with standards and looking at multiple sites, that hopefully is also going to have some consent basis to it and have multiple sites, people need to be confident that Congress means what it says about consent. Nevada has said no, will continue to say no. You can't say you're doing a consent program and having the first repository in a non-consenting state.
So assume consent is there by the appropriate jurisdictions and the geologic conditions are favorable to the agreed upon standards, and that the economics are also agreeable to the local municipality as well as the state municipality. Does it make sense with a market-based approach to have multiple sites?
Yes, there have to be multiple sites, technically, as well as from whatever market incentives that you put in. Because people have to understand that this is a shared responsibility.
Okay. Simultaneously with identifying sites that work, and I'm going to turn to you now, Mr. Stetson, is making sure that we have the appropriate transportation system in effect to be able to move the waste, and maybe there are others that want to weigh in on this as well. But that is certainly one of the issues that goes along with where we house it, how do we get it there. I do know the United States Department of Defense is transferring spent nuclear fuel on a daily basis around the country. Am I correct? Maybe not a daily basis, but on a regular basis. So this isn't something that we have no experience doing. We have experience transporting spent nuclear fuels, but is it unique with the reactors spent fuel? Does it require additional logistics, additional safety concerns? Please elaborate on that.
Actually, I think Mr. Morris or Mr. Isaac would be better prepared than I would be to answer those questions.
Thank you.
So the casks or the transport casks are that we have licensed and certified are extremely robust. I mentioned that they have to endure pretty violent tests in succession, I might add, of a violent impact, excessive heat for extended periods of time, and then full submersion in sequence. So these are extreme cask itself. So the fuel, and by the way, the fuel itself, as such, the nation is actively pursuing and would be better prepared. But the third leg of the stool is the transportation.
And I'm going to use songs as an example. So if songs potential earthquake that could cause a spill, a significant spill, what would be the protocol at that point as far as addressing the spill and addressing the 8.1 million people living within?
As I mentioned earlier, the security aspects to ensure that the on-site security force can repel a very substantial adversary force. And it includes, I can't get into the details, but, vehicle bombs and armed adversaries, insiders, the whole bit, for the fuel that's in the pool. For the fuel that's in the dry casks, the nature of the storage, it makes it such that it's very self-protecting and doesn't require as much security infrastructure to protect. That being said, if there were some sort of breach, we have also got risks associated with a shutdown reactor, particularly when the fuel has had the opportunity to cool from a hazard standpoint, than would be for an operating reactor. And as such,
But just to push a little bit further, if there was.
well, the NRC, initially the licensee would report the incident. They're obligated to report that incident within 15 minutes to the state and local authorities. They're obligated to report that to us in the federal government hour. And at that point, the entirety of the national response framework would be engaged, which involves a large array of not only federal entities, but they would be in support of the state and local entities. And the county emergency supervisor and the local emergency services directors have worked together to ensure that, particularly for an operating reactor, that they understand the protocols, they work together, they practice together, they know each other well, and can quickly and efficiently respond under those circumstances. On a shutdown decommission reactor, the plan changes slightly. Planning licensees can ask for an exemption for that, which we have typically granted, simply because the radiological hazard is not as significant as it once was in the operating reactor. And as such, the off-site state and local response and responding to emergencies, the all hazards plan, and this would fall within that, and they would come to the aid of Edison to the extent it was needed.
Yes.
Sometimes it pays to be a former government official. A little piece of history. During the operations of SONGS and during that period of time, and I'm going to be brief and less accurate than some of these folks could be, the operating plan, failure of the pooled storage and a possible catastrophic failure of one of the active reactors included a pretty massive withdrawal of more than 1 million people from the surrounding area. It included the backup facility of the Marines at Camp Pendleton to provide safety. It included the shutdown of Interstate 5 and, quite frankly, impacted the operation of Interstate 15, meaning there was effectively no north-south route for over 10 million Californians to take, and for that matter, all the international traffic. So the reason I bring it up is that as they finally get the last of the liquid storage into dry cask, that does change, and I think the experts would agree that it reduces. What doesn't reduce, though, is that if your catastrophic example of a terrorist attack were to cause a breach of these massive concrete casks, such that you would have exposed high-level radioactive material. If, for example, those casks were sitting, and I'm going to use the example that the two Californians brought up because I think it's a good one, if it was sitting right at the corner of Fort Irwin, 29 Palms, and Andrews and so on, or Edwards, I'm sorry, if we were sitting out in the California desert, 70 miles from the nearest town, then the answer would be that you would have to bring people in hazmat suits and do the repair. Clearly, as the former representative of this district, if it were to happen where they currently are, it would clearly shut down Interstate 5. It would impact the operation of the base, of ocean traffic, of air traffic for a protracted period of time. And I think that's the important question you deserve an answer for. As long as these are there, as remote as the possibility is, your example of a deliberate attack leading to a breach is dramatically different if it's here versus the desert even of California.
Thank you for that clarification, because I had the opportunity to tour the Port of Long Beach last week, and when you take the Port of Long Beach and the Port of LA into account together, 40% of the goods that come into our country via ship coming through those ports would be within that radius we talked about earlier. With that, I will open it up to the other members here to ask additional questions.
Mr. Stetson, two questions for you. On May 15th, the Orange County Register published an article entitled "Moving Nuclear Waste at San Onofre Sparks War of Words Between Contractor and Community Panel." And you're the vice chair of that panel. Dr. Victor is not here, so I'm going to direct these to you. The article describes a letter that you and Community Engagement Panel leadership sent to Southern California Edison that outlines concerns with Holtec's management of Canister downloading its songs, as well as its corporate governance. Holtec responded to you by describing your letter as, quote, "irresponsible claptrap," end quote. Chair Ruda, I ask unanimous consent that the Community Engagement Panel letter to Southern California Edison and Holtec's letter to the Community Engagement Panel in response are included in the hearing record.
Without objection, so done.
Mr. Stetson, can you please describe for us the concerns that you and Dr. Victor and others on the CEP have with Holtec, the company's governance, and its action?
Itself, we can understand their concerns, but we felt that it was appropriate primarily to address it since Southern California Edison is the one that is the primary party involved. Really, our efforts should be directed with Southern California Edison, and we should not get back and forth in any sort of a duel with Holtec.
Well, I hope that members of the public that haven't had the opportunity to read the letter from Holtec to my friend David Victor, who is a volunteer chair of the Community Engagement Panel and a professor at UC San Diego with whom I work on a number of issues. I hope you have a chance to read this letter because I find it concerning, particularly from a company that is not just responsible for the canisters at San Onofre, but also for roughly half of our nation's nuclear fuel across the country. In fact, they're one of the two applicants for a consolidated interim storage site in New Mexico. So I think this is something everyone needs to realize. Mr. Morris, last week the NRC announced that it had given permission to resume loading canisters at songs. We had a meeting subsequent to that, and the NRC has since told the public and Congress that it could take Edison multiple before it does so. My commit to informing Orange County and San Diego area members of Congress, like me and Chair Ruda and others in the San Diego delegation, and the Orange County, France, Canada, all of whom have national nuclear waste, which I understand is a long-term spent fuel management strategy in Canada, one that you pointed to as a goal to San Onofre.
Sure. So adaptive phase management was run technically very, very well early on. When I was in the government, we used to collaborate with them. And then the program was stopped by an independent panel who said that from a scientific and technical point of view, they created a new organization called the Nuclear Waste Management Organization to take responsibility for that. They came up with a dual approach to how to approach this issue. And Canada has a lot of spent nuclear fuel. They have a scientific and technical method, which is very similar to what we want to do, which is to ultimately dispose of it in a deep geological repository, and a management approach. So science and management. The management approach is called adaptive phase. You keep your eye on the ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal is safe, permanent isolation of this waste from the accessible environment. But we know that these programs take very, very long time, generations to implement, even if you're on schedule. Generations. So every once in a while, as you reach a certain point, it makes sense to sort of pause and ask yourself, I know it might make it prudent to revisit certain aspects of the program. Maybe science and technology has advanced. Maybe politics have changed. Maybe the value system in the country has changed or in the region has changed. And ask yourself, am I still making the prudent decisions going forward, or can I improve? one of the aspects of effective management is continuous improvement. You shouldn't rest on what you have. You should always ask yourself, can I do better? That's in essence what adaptive phase management is. And I think as it might apply to Southern Cal Edison or any other utility in a similar circumstance, it would be a prudent thing to every once in a while take a pause at an appropriate time and ask things that I might learn and do to improve the program.
So I would offer that in that spirit, that this is exactly the time for Southern California Edison and the NRC to do that, to look at the practices that are occurring on site, the selection of the whole tech canisters, the procedures that have led to the scratching and gouging of canisters that may lead to unnecessary public risk, and to assess and to take the time to be prudent and cautious to assess whether these are the safest practices moving forward. I can tell you that I believe the San Diego and Orange County delegation in Congress insists that you do that. And I'll yield back to the chair.
I'm going to start with Mr. Isaac, but again, anybody can jump in if you have additional input. But I do want to dig in deeper on market-based solutions. And I also want to look at that both from a midterm and a long-term solution. And there's also another variable or another option in there, and I don't recall what it was called, but instead of having nuclear waste go into long-term underground repositories, I believe I read somewhere about the idea of a midterm situation where it can provide a solution for maybe a couple hundred years, but then there's another continued effort to move it into another spot. I just want you to elaborate on all this because we have to start identifying solutions in moving it, the existing 100 sites to midterm, long-term solutions. So if you could help us understand, these folks here understand a little bit more.
So first of all, I think you've done a very nice job just now explaining the situation. Yeah, it is my view, and it was the view of the Blue Ribbon Commission that, and it's been this view for quite some time, by the way, that we need both interim storage, centralized or regional interim storage, and we need an ultimate final repository for permanent disposal. This waste, as has been mentioned by you, is hazardous potentially for very long periods of time, geologic time periods. And so the consensus is that while we can store waste safely for decades, generations, it requires active administrative control to assure that. And if you stored it long enough, ultimately those containers would have to be unloaded and the waste would have to be loaded into new containers. And that seems to be, to everyone who was looked at in this country and abroad, not a very pragmatic solution. So the answer was we should come up with a solution that allows for, but doesn't require, active administrative control. And as early as 1957, our national that it is operating the way we think it is on. And now you can watch it, monitor it if you want, but you don't have to worry about 1,000 years, 10,000, 100,000 years of safety. The geology and the engineering that you do in there should do the job. So that's the general approach. But building a repository takes a long time, as we have seen. Even if we got the program we started, it's going to take decades. And it seems prudent to me and to others that we should one or more places that are dedicated to managing spent fuel. These reactor sites, San Onofre and elsewhere, when they were developed, part of it was not, oh, and by the way, you're going to have this waste forever, so you need to plan on managing it forever. So there ought to be places put together in appropriate locations for management, temporary storage, temporary meaning in nuclear waste terms, decades, generations, to transfer that waste in an orderly fashion from the reactors, particularly from shutdown reactors, so that you can offload the spent fuel, decommission those reactors that are shut down, and put that land again into useful use in the locations where they're located. So that's
from a regulatory framework, and Mr. Hancock, perhaps you take this, and Mr. Morse, you as well. From a regulatory framework, is it easier to site spent nuclear fuel in a regional facility that is more short-term than long-term, or is it are we jumping through the same hurdles and hoops and timeframes?
Is it easier? I
And
don't
it's
know.
a very relative.
Yeah, I don't know that it's easier. I mean, when it comes to, you know, the,
Let me ask you this, is it a shorter timeframe?
to the interim storage? Well, based on the current track we're on, I expect that we'll be in a position to make a final license decision on the New Mexico and Texas applications in the next 2 years. I mean, the original plan, as I said, was 2020. That's when the contentions get resolved, that may result in hearings, et cetera. So, but it's likelier on a faster path than where we're at currently with the Yucca.
It already licensed a consolidated interim storage site for 40,000 metric tons of fuel at private fuel storage in Utah. That was done in 2006. So a site exists, but it hasn't been used, and it won't be used for a couple of reasons. One, there's strong opposition to reactors. Why are we only looking at states without reactors for either interim or long-term disposal? So that's one point. The other point that you talked about in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, is east of the 100th meridian, quite a ways away from where we are. So there's got to be responsibility, management and otherwise, taken by folks in that eastern part of the country for interim storage. That's where it is. They are going to have to take responsibility. Many of these plants are planning to be open for 40 more years. So they're going to be storing more waste. Mentioned, if you really want to think about incentives, they don't want accidents for liability, and operating power plants can't operate if they're having accidents. So I would really encourage some discussion with the nuclear industry about what kind of incentives they need in order to talk about one or more, probably multiple, consolidated storage sites.
And Mike, I'll get back to you here in a moment. Another question that came up somewhat, I think, Mr. Morris, you perhaps flagged this for me to ask. What are other countries doing? What is other countries around the world who, I recognize that France and many of our European allies probably have sophisticated ways to manage this process, including Canada. Are there any countries that we are concerned? Because I think what you're alluding to, when you start looking at 100 years out, 200 years out, 300 years out, the financial viability of any country at that time, which we do not know what it will be, their ability to manage a nuclear waste issue that is going to be around for tens of thousands of years. So what is the potential concern we're seeing in other countries' ability or inability to adequately address spent nuclear fuel?
Well, I don't know that I'm prepared to answer the question about the status of what other countries, perhaps Mr. Lynn would be better suited.
I'd be happy to help respond to that.
Maybe want to the microphone a little bit.
Sure.
Thank you.
So first, as you suggest, there are several countries that have made substantial progress in solving this problem. The leading countries in the world right now, very interesting stage, where they had a consent-based approach. They had a number of sites that expressed some interest years or so. So that's an active program. It's not guaranteed success, but it seems to be going quite well. At the other, there are a number of countries that are in very difficult circumstances. For example, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, all three of which have had extensive nuclear power, relied on nuclear power greatly for large percentages of their electricity, but they are small countries with limited geographical or topographical opportunities to site these facilities because they're very mountainous, and where they're not mountainous, they're very highly populated. So I actually work on this issue through a grant that I'm participating with senior managers in several of these countries, the Pacific Rim countries, to share better succeed with this. They're in tough circumstances, difficult of citing a temporary storage and a repository for both population reasons and geographic reasons. which has led several countries to look at prospects, which I won't go into now unless you go to me, for multinational facilities, where countries would come together and cooperate on one or more facilities that they could share. The obvious question that immediately pops up is, they're all for it, they just don't want it to be in their country.
Similar to Mr. Hancock, what you're talking about with some of the utilities working together in a concerted effort. Representative Isom.
You know, one of the limitations being a former member is unless you ask a question like that, I'm in a non-lobby 1 year freeze, so thank you for asking the question. As a member of Congress, you have the most freedom to explore all the solutions to the problems that we're talking about today and to push for solutions, and particularly economic solutions. And I'll tick off a couple of them. First of all, the answer to your earlier question is, Russia is a poster child for a country that ran out of money, let nuclear submarines sit with hot fuel on them, in some cases sink. If not for the U.S. initiative, Kazakhstan would still have all of its spent plutonium, or not unspent plutonium. We've actually harvested it and returned it to Mother Russia. By the way, bear in mind, the Russians have never given up 1 ounce of plutonium. They were happy to have us spend the money to make Kazakhstan safer, but they took back that high-level valuable cargo. So when we look at countries running out of money, that's a very valid concern, and I think that should be a global concern that Congress should lead on. The second, though, is that there are a number of solutions that have been talked about here today that exist, but they do for example, in Congressman Levin's district, you have atomic. They have been a leader on a number of solutions, including the ability to actually turn plutonium into energy in the reprocessing area, additionally, in some other creative areas. Those solutions would require Congress to empower DOE to go further than just the studies. And in some cases, it might be said if we had repositories to quickly, safely movement of next generation rail and production of them so that they would be available when we reach that surge opportunity, whether it's one or more sites. Today, we are looking at when SONGS becomes available, you're going to still be standing in line for years waiting for a train to come in to take one at a time of these casts. That could be something that you could do today. So reprocessing, that. The last one is the one we've been talking around. If, in fact, the government of New Mexico, if we look at Humboldt Bay, Diablo Canyon, and these 3 facilities all would benefit by at least going to a regional facility that, quite frankly, Congress and this state would put a priority on. Nobody can tell the state of California that if the solution doesn't come federally, that California is empowered to do something at least to help the citizens of these highly populated areas. All of those areas that you could be working on, I recommend that you work on all of those as though you're never going to have these other 2 sites or Yucca, that you work on these other solutions, because if you fail from now, a very senior Congressman Levin will be where I
Well, in 10 years, I'd be a little older, a little grayer. Hopefully, we'll make some progress, but I appreciate that. A few more questions, Mr. Morris. What's the annual budget of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission?
And declining, I believe the FY19 budget is approximately
Would be per year. So, what's the cost of inspecting the canisters as you did? You inspected, along with Edison's help, 8 of the 21 canisters, is my understanding. What was the cost of doing that?
I don't know exactly, but I mean, it was
Estimate.
$20,000.
$20,000.
Just to do the, you said the 8 canisters?
The 8 canisters. What would the incremental cost have been of inspecting all?
Actually do again, I'd be guessing, I've heard numbers in the couple $100,000 per canister, but I don't know.
Just to inspect them?
Just to do to pull, and they covered, the vast majority of the surface area.
But I thought a second ago you said to inspect the 8 was only $20,000?
Oh, I was referring to the cost of our
To the NRC. Okay, so the cost to Edison is higher.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so
Because
the.
we don't purchase the equipment.
There would be no incremental cost to the NRC. What do you estimate the incremental cost would be to Edison? Maybe a few
To do
million
the
dollars?
remaining 21 can,
22, yeah, or 21.
again, it would be absolute guesswork on my part, but if it was a couple $300,000 per canister times 20, so
Okay.
a couple million.
Do you think that's worth the money?
I believe that the analysis that the Edison folks did, and by the way, we witnessed the collection of that analysis on their own, that incorporated not only the real data they collected, but made a number of assumptions about worst case effects of manufacturing defects and even what additional scratching might be incurred upon withdrawal of the canister, not simply the insertion. And we did an independent review of that, and similarly concluded that their analysis was robust and sufficient. We also did our own evaluation of the data, and it's, again, provided the confidence that we had that worst case scratching, even for the remaining 40 some odd canisters, within the limits of the code standard. So I think.
But just for the public's awareness, there were 29 canisters, of which 2 had issues, number 22 and number 29. And number 29 was the one that was almost dropped 18 feet. Yet Edison and the NRC decided to only inspect 8 of those canisters. An inspection of 8 to 29 would be sufficient. I would say with something this significant, where again, you have over 8 million people within a 50-mile radius, where you have active earthquake faults, and the rest, and particularly when you have behavior from an actor like Holtec in the regard that they've treated the community engagement panel, I would encourage that you spend the extra money and you inspect the rest of the canisters. A couple more questions on the canisters. Do they have, to your knowledge, best of your knowledge, do they have real-time monitoring for radioactivity?
It's my understanding is this could comment on that. They made a commitment with respect to, they described it to the panel meeting the other night.
That's correct. Edison has promised to have full-time radiation monitoring as long as the spent fuel is on site.
So hopefully we can follow up with Edison. They're not here to pick on this morning, but I'd like to follow up to understand the specific date by which they'll have real-time radiation monitoring in place. Also, to the best of your knowledge, they have real-time humidity monitoring, given that this is a coastal area with very high salinity. There's a lot of scientific dispute over whether or not the humidity in the area could impact the canisters negatively.
I actually don't know the answer.
Be part of the adaptive phase management, thinking through whether these canisters make the most sense and what type of monitoring is needed to ensure that they do. With that, I have a few closing remarks, but I appreciate your willingness to engage. I mean that sincerely, and more to come.
As I mentioned earlier, we're going to do this a little bit informal. So I would like to take a moment for each of you, and Representative Vice, I'll have you start off. If there's anything we did not ask or that you wished we had asked, or something that you feel happened.
I think that the most